The sun was setting over Oak Ridge, painting the sky with beautiful orange and pink colors. James Chen had just come home from his job at the local computer store. He was tired but happy. Today was Friday, and he was looking forward to a quiet weekend at home. James had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. Everyone knew him as the friendly man who always helped his neighbors. He loved his small house with the blue door and the garden full of flowers. At 45 years old, James was a simple man who enjoyed simple things: gardening, cooking, and watching old movies. As James was making dinner, his doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Wilson, his next-door neighbor. She was 78 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes behind her glasses. "Good evening, James," she said with a warm smile. "I need to ask you a favor." "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. What can I do for you?" James asked, inviting her in. Mrs. Wilson explained that she needed to visit her daughter for the weekend. Her daughter had just had a baby, and Mrs. Wilson wanted to help her. "Could you please water my plants while I'm gone?" she asked. "Especially my orchids. They need special care." "I'd be happy to help," James said without hesitation. He had watched Mrs. Wilson's house many times before. Mrs. Wilson gave him her spare key and a piece of paper with instructions for each plant. She also wrote down her phone number, just in case. "Thank you so much, James. You're a lifesaver," she said before leaving. The next evening, after finishing his own gardening, James remembered his promise to Mrs. Wilson. He grabbed her key and the note with instructions and walked over to her house. It was getting dark, so he turned on his phone's flashlight to see the keyhole better. What James didn't know was that someone was watching him. A new family had moved in across the street just a week ago. They didn't know James or his relationship with Mrs. Wilson. When they saw a man with a flashlight trying to enter Mrs. Wilson's house, they became worried and called the police. 911, "What's your emergency?" the operator asked. "There's a suspicious man entering my neighbor's house," the caller said. "I think it might be a break-in." Officer Sarah Rodriguez was just 2 months into her job at the Oak Ridge Police Department. Before this, she had worked in a big city where crime was common. Every call about a suspicious person could mean danger. She was still getting used to the quiet life in Oak Ridge. When the call came in about a possible break-in, Officer Rodriguez responded immediately. She drove to Mrs. Wilson's address with her police lights off, not wanting to alert the possible thief. Inside Mrs. Wilson's house, James was carefully watering the plants. He followed the instructions exactly, making sure each plant got the right amount of water. The orchids were in the kitchen, near the window. James filled a special watering can and started to water them gently. The house was quiet except for the sound of water. James was humming a song, thinking about what movie he would watch later that night. He didn't hear the police car parking outside. He didn't notice Officer Rodriguez walking quietly around the house, looking through windows. Officer Rodriguez saw a man in the kitchen. From her angle, it looked like he was searching through cabinets. She couldn't see the watering can in his hands. Following her training, she positioned herself at the side door, the same door James had used to enter. With her hand on her gun, Officer Rodriguez took a deep breath and prepared to confront what she believed was a thief in progress. James was carefully watering Mrs. Wilson's favorite orchid. It was a beautiful purple flower that she had grown for many years. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water and James' soft humming. Suddenly, the side door burst open. "Police! Don't move!" a strong voice commanded. James jumped in surprise. The watering can slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. Water splashed everywhere. He turned around and saw a police officer standing at the door. She had her hand on her gun, ready to pull it out. It was Officer Rodriguez. Her face was serious, and her eyes were alert. She had been trained to handle dangerous situations, and right now, she believed she was facing a burglar. "Turn around slowly and put your hands where I can see them," Officer Rodriguez ordered. Her voice was firm and left no room for argument. James felt his heart beating fast. His hands began to shake. He had never been in trouble with the police before. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he had to stay calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," James said, raising his hands above his head. "I'm just watering Mrs. Wilson's plants. She asked me to take care of them while she's away." Officer Rodriguez didn't believe him. She had seen too many criminals make up stories when caught. "Keep your hands where I can see them and step away from the counter," she instructed. James moved slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Officer, please, this is a misunderstanding. I'm Mrs. Wilson's neighbor. She gave me her key. His voice was shaking now. I'm going to need you to sit down on that chair, Officer Rodriguez said, pointing to a kitchen chair with her free hand. We'll sort this out, but first, I need to make sure the situation is safe. James sat down, still keeping his hands visible. He was scared but tried to remain calm. Please check my pocket, he said. Mrs. Wilson's note is in there with her phone number. You can call her and check. Do not reach for your pockets, Officer Rodriguez shouted, now drawing her weapon completely. She pointed it at James, who froze in fear. I wasn't going to, James said quickly. I'm just telling you where the note is. I can stay still while you check. Outside, the sound of the police officer's loud voice had attracted attention. Mrs. Wilson's other neighbor, Mrs. Parker, was walking her dog. She heard the commotion and looked through the kitchen window. She saw James sitting in the chair with his hands up and the police officer pointing a gun at him. Mrs. Parker was shocked. She had known James for years. He was one of the kindest people in the neighborhood. She quickly tied her dog's leash to a tree and rushed to the side door. Officer, officer, Mrs. Parker called out as she approached the door. There's a mistake. Officer Rodriguez turned slightly, keeping her eyes and gun still mostly focused on James. Ma'am, please stay back. This is police business. But that's James Chen. He lives next door to Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Parker explained urgently. He's looking after her house while she's away visiting her daughter. He's not a thief. Officer Rodriguez hesitated. This was new information that didn't fit with what she had assumed. She kept her gun pointed at James but looked at Mrs. Parker more carefully. You know this man? Officer Rodriguez asked Mrs. Parker. Of course I do. We've all been neighbors for years. James is the most helpful person on this street. Mrs. Wilson always asks him to water her plants when she's away. James nodded, relief washing over his face. That's what I was trying to explain. Please, check the note in my pocket or call Mrs. Wilson. Officer Rodriguez was now unsure. Her training told her to remain cautious, but the neighbor's words made sense. She had to make a decision. What Officer Rodriguez didn't know was that this moment was being recorded. Not just one, but 2 cameras were capturing everything that happened in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen. The tension in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen was still high. Officer Rodriguez had lowered her gun slightly but hadn't put it away. James remained seated with his hands visible, trying his best to stay calm. Mrs. Parker stood at the door, nervously watching the scene. I need to verify this story, Officer Rodriguez said firmly. She kept her eyes on James while speaking into her radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Rodriguez. I need to contact a Mrs. Wilson about a possible break-in at her residence. While Officer Rodriguez was calling dispatch, something else was happening. Mrs. Wilson had installed a new security camera just days before her trip. It sat quietly on the bookshelf in the corner of the kitchen, recording everything. Its small green light blinked as it captured the tense standoff. But that wasn't the only camera recording the scene. Outside the house, 17-year-old Zach Taylor was walking home from basketball practice. Zach lived 3 houses down from Mrs. Wilson. When he saw the police car parked in front of her house and heard raised voices, he became curious. He moved closer to the kitchen window and peeked inside. What he saw shocked him. James Chen, the man who had helped his family move in last year, was sitting in a chair with his hands up while a police officer pointed a gun at him. Without thinking, Zach pulled out his phone and started filming through the window. This is crazy, Zach whispered to himself as he recorded. His hand shook slightly, but he managed to keep the phone steady enough to capture the scene. Back inside, Officer Rodriguez received a response from dispatch. Officer Rodriguez, we've reached Mrs. Wilson. She confirms that her neighbor James Chen has permission to be in her house. She says he's watering her plants while she's away. The tension in Officer Rodriguez's shoulders eased slightly. She lowered her gun completely, but didn't put it away yet. I'd apologize for the confusion, Mr. Chen, she said, her voice more gentle now. We received a call about a suspicious person entering this house, and I had to respond accordingly. James nodded, slowly lowering his hands. I understand you were just doing your job, officer. But I've been Mrs. Wilson's neighbor for 15 years. I always help her when she's away. May I see the note Mrs. Wilson gave you? Officer Rodriguez asked. Yes, it's in my right pocket, James said, pointing to his shirt pocket. Go ahead and take it out slowly, Officer Rodriguez instructed. James carefully reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Officer Rodriguez. The note was written in Mrs. Wilson's neat handwriting. It listed all her plants and how to care for them. At the bottom was her phone number and a thank you message to James. Officer Rodriguez read the note and finally holstered her weapon. I'm sorry about this misunderstanding, Mr. Chen. The caller didn't know you had permission to be here. Mrs. Parker sighed with relief. Thank goodness that's cleared up. James, are you okay? James nodded, though his hands were still shaking slightly. I'm fine, just a bit shaken. Outside, Zach was still recording. He captured the moment Officer Rodriguez put away her gun and the visible relief on James's face. When he saw that the situation was under control, he stopped recording and looked at the video on his phone. People need to see this, Zach thought. Without hesitation, he opened his social media app and uploaded the video with the caption, Cop almost shoots innocent man watering plants. #policy mistake #Oakridge. What Zach didn't realize was how quickly his video would spread. Within minutes, it had already been shared dozens of times. By the time James walked back to his house and Officer Rodriguez returned to her patrol car, the video was beginning to go viral. Neither of them knew that by morning, their faces would be on screens across the country, and that Mrs. Wilson's security camera footage would soon be requested by news stations eager to show both sides of the story. James Chen woke up early the next morning. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Rodriguez pointing her gun at him. His hand still trembled slightly as he made his morning coffee. His phone beeped with a message. It was from his niece in California. Uncle James, is this you in this video? Are you okay? She had sent a link to a social media post. James clicked on it and was shocked to see himself on the screen. It was a video of the incident from last night, filmed through Mrs. Wilson's kitchen window. The video already had over 50,000 views and thousands of comments. Oh no, James whispered. He sat down heavily on his couch, spilling some of his coffee. Across town, Officer Sarah Rodriguez was getting similar messages. She had just finished her night shift and was preparing to go home when the police chief called her into his office. Rodriguez, have you seen this? The chief asked, turning his computer screen toward her. The same video was playing, but now it had over 100,000 views. Officer Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. Sir, I can explain. I was responding to a call about a break-in. The chief raised his hand to stop her. I know, I've reviewed your body camera footage. You followed procedure. But this doesn't look good for the department. The media is already calling for comments. Meanwhile, Zach Taylor was surprised by how quickly his video had spread. When he woke up and checked his phone, he had thousands of notifications. News channels were sending him messages asking for permission to use his video. His parents were not happy. Zach, what were you thinking posting this without talking to us first? His father asked, looking worried. I thought people should see it, Zach said, but he was beginning to realize the impact of what he had done. By noon, the story had made local news. A reporter stood outside Mrs. Wilson's house, speaking into a camera. Behind me is the house where last night's incident occurred. A local man was watering his elderly neighbor's plants when police confronted him, mistaking him for a burglar. The video of the confrontation has gone viral, raising questions about police procedures and racial profiling. James's phone rang constantly. Friends, family, and even strangers who had found his number were calling to check on him. Some news reporters asked for interviews. James didn't know what to do. He decided to call Mrs. Wilson to tell her what was happening. Mrs. Wilson was shocked when she heard the news. Oh dear, James, I'm so sorry this happened to you in my house. Are you all right? I'm okay, Mrs. Wilson, James assured her, but your house is on the news. They're talking about your security camera, too. Mrs. Wilson was quiet for a moment. My security camera. That's right. It would have recorded everything. James, that video might help show the complete story. James hadn't thought about that. Zach's video only showed part of what happened, from one angle through a window. Mrs. Wilson's security camera would have captured everything from inside the kitchen, including the sound. While they were talking, Officer Rodriguez was meeting with the police department's public relations team. They were preparing a statement about the incident. "We need to be transparent," the PR manager said. "Officer Rodriguez, are you comfortable with us releasing your body camera footage?" Officer Rodriguez nodded. She knew the body camera would show that she had followed proper procedure, even if the outcome had been unfortunate. By evening, 3 different videos of the same incident were circulating online. Zach's cell phone video, Officer Rodriguez's body camera footage, and now Mrs. Wilson's security camera video, which she had authorized the police to release. The public reaction was divided. Some people criticized Officer Rodriguez for pulling her gun on an innocent man. Others defended her, saying she was responding appropriately to what she thought was a burglary. What no one expected was what would happen next, when James Chen and Officer Sarah Rodriguez would meet again, face to face. 2 days after the incident, James Chen sat nervously in the coffee shop downtown. He checked his watch again. It was almost 3:00 p.m. He wondered if she would actually come. The bell above the door jingled, and Officer Sarah Rodriguez walked in. She was wearing regular clothes instead of her police uniform, jeans, and a blue sweater. She looked different, more like a normal person and less like the scary officer who had pointed a gun at him. James raised his hand slightly to get her attention. When Officer Rodriguez saw him, she took a deep breath and walked over to his table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Chen," she said, sitting down across from him. "You can call me James," he replied, trying to smile. The police chief had suggested this meeting. After all 3 videos went viral, the department was trying to show they cared about community relations. Officer Rodriguez had agreed immediately. She wanted to apologize properly. "James, I want to say how sorry I am about what happened," Officer Rodriguez began. "I was doing my job, but I understand how frightening it must have been for you." James nodded. "It was scary. I'd never had a gun pointed at me before." His hands shook slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. "Before I worked in Oak Ridge, I was in a big city where break-ins often turned dangerous," Officer Rodriguez explained. "I brought that mindset with me. I'm learning that things are different here." A waitress came over and took Officer Rodriguez's order, just a black coffee. When she left, James decided to ask a question that had been bothering him. "Can I ask you something? Would you have acted the same way if I was?" He paused, unsure how to finish. "If you were white?" Officer Rodriguez finished for him. She looked down at her hands. "I've asked myself that same question. I want to believe I would have, but I can't be sure. We all have biases we don't recognize." James appreciated her honesty. "That's fair. At least you're thinking about it." Outside the coffee shop, a few people walked by and noticed them sitting together. One woman took out her phone and snapped a picture through the window. Neither James nor Officer Rodriguez noticed. "How are you handling all the attention?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Some people are calling me a hero for following protocol, others." She didn't finish. "Others are calling you racist," James said quietly. "I know. They're saying similar things about me. Some people think I'm a victim, others think I should have been more careful. It's exhausting." Officer Rodriguez nodded in agreement. No one sees the whole picture. They just take sides. As they talked, they discovered they had things in common. Both had moved to Oak Ridge for the quiet life. Both enjoyed gardening. Officer Rodriguez even asked for advice about her struggling tomato plants. Mrs. Wilson called James while they were talking. He put the phone on speaker so Officer Rodriguez could say hello. "I'm coming home tomorrow," Mrs. Wilson told them. "The news people won't leave my house alone. They keep asking about my security camera. I told them it was just to watch my bird feeder." James and Officer Rodriguez both laughed. It felt good to laugh after everything that had happened. "Mrs. Wilson, would you like a police escort from the airport?" Officer Rodriguez offered. "It's the least I can do." "That would be lovely, dear," Mrs. Wilson replied. "And maybe you can both come for dinner. I make an excellent lasagna." As they ended the call, the coffee shop manager approached their table. He looked nervous. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I don't want to bother you, but there's a news van pulling up outside. I think someone told them you're both here." James and Officer Rodriguez looked at each other. The peaceful moment was over. The story wasn't finished with them yet. James and Officer Rodriguez quickly left the coffee shop through the back door. They managed to avoid the news van, but both knew they couldn't hide forever. The story had become bigger than just the two of them. The next morning, Mayor Thompson called an emergency town meeting at the Oak Ridge Community Center. The large room was packed with people. Some held signs supporting the police. Others had signs calling for better police training. The mood was tense. James sat in the front row next to Mrs. Wilson, who had returned from her trip early because of all the attention. Officer Rodriguez sat with other police officers on the other side of the room. They exchanged small smiles when they saw each other. Mayor Thompson, a tall woman with short gray hair, stood at the podium. "We are here today to discuss the incident that has brought national attention to our small town," she began. "I want everyone to speak respectfully and listen carefully." Many people came forward to speak. Mrs. Parker, who had witnessed the incident, described how scared she felt seeing a gun pointed at James. "I've known James for years. He's a good man. No one should feel unsafe while watering plants." A retired police officer spoke next. "Officers have to make split-second decisions. They never know if a situation is dangerous until it's too late." Officer Rodriguez followed her training. The discussion became heated at times. Some people shouted, others cried. The mayor had to ask for quiet several times. Then Zach Taylor, the teenager who had recorded the video, walked to the microphone. His parents stood behind him, looking nervous. "I want to apologize," Zach said, his voice shaking. "I posted that video without thinking. I didn't ask Mr. Chen if it was okay. I didn't think about how it would affect Officer Rodriguez. I just wanted to show what I saw." The room grew quiet. No one had expected the young man to apologize. "I've learned that one video doesn't tell the whole story," Zach continued. "When I watched Mrs. Wilson's security camera footage and the police body cam, I saw things I missed. I saw Officer Rodriguez trying to do her job. I saw Mr. Chen being brave and calm." Mayor Thompson thanked Zach for his honesty. Then she asked if James or Officer Rodriguez wanted to speak. James looked at Officer Rodriguez. She nodded, and they both walked to the front together. People whispered as they saw them stand side by side. "I was scared when Officer Rodriguez pointed her gun at me," James said simply. "But I understand she was responding to what she thought was a crime. We talked about it. We're learning from each other." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "I'm new to Oak Ridge," she said. "Where I worked before, every call could be dangerous. I brought that fear with me. I'm working to change my approach." She looked at James. "And I'm grateful Mr. Chen was willing to talk with me instead of just being angry." After they spoke, Mayor Thompson announced new plans for the town. There would be a Know Your Neighbor program where residents could meet and learn about each other. The police department would have more community training. And Mrs. Wilson suggested a system where neighbors could register when they were helping each other so police would know. As the meeting ended, something unexpected happened. A photo appeared on the town's social media page. It was James and Officer Rodriguez sitting together in the coffee shop, talking and smiling. The caption read, "This is how problems get solved, with conversation, not anger." The photo was already getting as many views as the original confrontation video, but this time the comments were mostly positive. As they left the community center, a national news crew approached James and Officer Rodriguez. "Would you be willing to tell your story on our evening program?" the reporter asked. James and Officer Rodriguez looked at each other. They had a decision to make. James and Officer Rodriguez decided to do the interview with the national news. They felt it was important to share their story in their own words. The reporter, Maria Garcia, set up cameras in Mrs. Wilson's living room. Mrs. Wilson insisted on being part of the interview too. "We're live in 5, 4, 3, 2. The cameraman pointed to Maria when it was time to start. "Good evening, America. I'm Maria Garcia, reporting from Oak Ridge, where a routine plant watering turned into a viral video sensation that has everyone talking about police practices and community relations. With me are James Chen, Officer Sarah Rodriguez, and homeowner Eleanor Wilson." The interview began with each person describing what happened from their point of view. James talked about his fear when he saw the gun. Officer Rodriguez explained the call she received and how she responded based on her training. Mrs. Wilson shared her shock when she learned what had happened in her kitchen. "What I want viewers to understand," Officer Rodriguez said, looking directly at the camera, "is that split-second decisions can have lasting consequences. I'm thankful no one was hurt, and I've learned valuable lessons about knowing the community I serve." James nodded. "And I've learned to be more aware of how my actions might look to others. Maybe putting a note on the door or telling other neighbors when I'll be at Mrs. Wilson's house would help." Mrs. Wilson patted James's hand. "You shouldn't have to announce yourself for doing a kind deed, dear, but these days perhaps it's wise." As they talked, viewers across the country watched. In living rooms, offices, and on phones, people saw three people from different backgrounds finding common ground. Social media filled with comments. "This is how adults handle problems." "Both sides listening to each other. We need more of this." "That Mrs. Wilson is a treasure. Can she adopt me?" After the interview, more invitations came in. Talk shows wanted James and Officer Rodriguez to appear. Universities asked them to speak about conflict resolution. A children's book author even asked if she could write a story based on the incident, featuring a friendly gardener and a careful police officer learning to work together. The attention was overwhelming. James, who loved his quiet life, found it difficult to deal with. One evening, as he was watering his own garden, trying to escape the phone calls and emails, Officer Rodriguez stopped by. "How are you holding up?" she asked, leaning on the fence. "I'm ready for this to be over," James admitted. "I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to help Mrs. Wilson with her plants." Officer Rodriguez laughed. "I know what you mean. My sister called me this morning to say she saw us on a morning show while she was at the gym. People I haven't talked to in years are texting me." "What do we do now?" James asked, turning off the hose. "I have an idea," Officer Rodriguez said. "Let's use this attention for something good, then ask for privacy. The police department needs better community engagement programs. Maybe we can help with that, then step back from the spotlight." James thought this was a good plan. Together, they wrote a statement asking for privacy and announcing a new community program called Neighbors Helping Neighbors. The program would help police know when residents were helping each other with house sitting, plant watering, or pet care. The next day, Mrs. Wilson invited James and Officer Rodriguez for the dinner she had promised. As they sat around her dining table enjoying her famous lasagna, Mrs. Wilson raised her glass of lemonade. "To new friendships formed in strange circumstances," she said, "and to my orchids, which somehow survived despite all the excitement." They all laughed and clinked their glasses together. Outside, the last news van finally drove away from Oak Ridge. The reporters had a new story to chase. But in Mrs. Wilson's dining room, the real story, one of understanding, forgiveness, and community, was just beginning. The flowers in Mrs. Wilson's garden were in full bloom. It was a beautiful spring day in Oak Ridge, exactly 1 year after the incident that had changed so many lives. Mrs. Wilson sat in her favorite garden chair, watching James Chen carefully trim her rose bushes. "Those roses had never looked better, James," Mrs. Wilson said with a smile. "You truly have a gift with plants." James smiled back. "Thank you, but I think your orchids still prefer your touch over mine." They both laughed, remembering how it all started with those orchids a year ago. So much had changed since that day. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors program was now used in towns across the country. When neighbors helped each other with house sitting or plant watering, they could register it with local police. This simple system had prevented several misunderstandings over the past year. The Oak Ridge Police Department had changed too. All officers now received special training on community relations. They spent time getting to know the neighborhoods they served. Officer Rodriguez had led much of this training, sharing what she had learned from her experience with James. As James and Mrs. Wilson enjoyed the garden, a police car pulled up in front of the house. Officer Sarah Rodriguez stepped out, no longer in her police uniform. She was wearing the police chief's badge. "Chief Rodriguez, right on time for tea," Mrs. Wilson called out. Sarah walked into the garden with a small cake box in her hands. "I wouldn't miss our anniversary tea for anything," she said. "And I brought Kate from that bakery you love, Mrs. Wilson." 3 months ago, the former police chief had retired, and Sarah had been promoted to replace him. Her work on community relations had impressed everyone, especially the mayor. They sat together at the garden table while Mrs. Wilson poured tea. Zach Taylor rode by on his bicycle and waved to them. He was heading to college in the fall to study journalism. Experience had taught him about the power and responsibility of sharing stories. Did you see the message from that town in California? Sarah asked as she accepted her cup of tea. They're starting their own version of our program next month. James nodded. It's amazing how far the idea has spread. I never thought something good could come from having a gun pointed at me. Mrs. Wilson patted his hand. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, dear. Sarah looked down at her tea. I still think about what could have happened if Mrs. Parker hadn't come by, if you hadn't stayed calm, James. But that's not what happened, James said firmly. Instead, we learned from each other. The town became stronger, and I gained two good friends. They smiled at each other, the tension of that day now a distant memory. As they enjoyed their tea and cake, a family moved into the house across the street. James noticed them struggling with boxes. Looks like new neighbors, he said. Should we go introduce ourselves? Absolutely, Sarah agreed. And we should tell them about the program too. Mrs. Wilson stood up slowly, using her cane. I'll bring them some of my welcome cookies. Everyone should feel at home in Oak Ridge. Together, the three friends walked across the street to welcome the new family. The mother looked surprised to see the police chief helping her new neighbors bring welcome cookies. Welcome to Oak Ridge, James said with a warm smile. We have a special community here. Very special, Sarah agreed. Would you like to hear a story about how a misunderstanding changed our town for the better? As the new family nodded, Mrs. Wilson winked at James and Sarah. Their story would continue to make a difference, one neighbor at a time. The end.